Zarathustra went down the mountain alone, no one meeting him. When he entered the forest, however, there suddenly stood before him an old man who had left his holy cot to seek roots. And thus spake the old man to Zarathustra. No stranger to me is this wanderer. Many years ago passed he by. Zarathustra he was called, but he hath altered. Then thou carriest thine ashes into the mountains. Wilt thou now carry the fire into the valleys? Fearest thou not the incendiary's doom? Yea, I recognize Zarathustra. Pure is his eye, and no loathing lurketh about his mouth. Goeth he not alone like a dancer? Altered is Zarathustra. A child hath Zarathustra become. An awakened one is Zarathustra. What wilt thou do in the land of the sleepers? As in the sea hast thou lived in solitude, and it hath borne thee up. Alas, wilt thou now go ashore? Alas, wilt thou again drag thy body thyself? Zarathustra answered, I love mankind. Why, said the saint, did I go into the forest and the desert? Was it not because I loved men far too well? Now I love God. Men I do not love. Man is a thing too imperfect for me. Love to man would be fatal to me. Zarathustra answered, What spake I of love? I am bringing gifts unto men. Give them nothing, said the saint. Take rather part of their load and carry it along with them. That will be most agreeable unto them, if only it be agreeable unto thee. If, however, thou wilt give unto them, give them no more than an alms, and let them also beg for it. No, replied Zarathustra, I give no alms. I am not poor enough for that. The saint laughed at Zarathustra and spake thus, Then see to it that they accept thy treasures. They are distrustful of anchorites, and do not believe that we come with gifts. The fall of our footsteps ringeth too hollow through their streets, and just as at night, when they are in bed and hear a man abroad long before sunrise, so they ask themselves concerning us, Where goeth the thief? Go not to men, but stay in the forest. Go rather to the animals. Why not be like me, a bear amongst bears, a bird amongst birds? And what doeth the saint in the forest? Asked Zarathustra. The saint answered, I make hymns and sing them. And in making hymns I laugh and weep and mumble. Thus do I praise God. With singing, weeping, laughing, and mumbling do I praise the God who is my God. But what dost thou bring us as a gift? When Zarathustra had heard these words, he bowed to the saint and said, What should I have to give thee? Let me rather hurry hence, lest I take aught away from thee. And thus they parted from one another, the old man and Zarathustra laughing like schoolboys. When Zarathustra was alone, however, he said to his heart, Could it be possible? The old saint in the forest hath not yet heard of it, that God is dead. Of the prologue of Thus Spake Zarathustra. Here we get to meet a new character called the old man / the saint. It's both terms are used interchangeably throughout this section of the prologue, so that's what I'm going to do here. And just know whenever I use one, I also mean the other. Right out the gate, we're told that no one meets Zarathustra when he reaches the bottom of the mountain. However, although no one meets him, when he enters the forest, this old man character suddenly appeared before him, and we get this really cool play on the title of the text, Thus Spake the Old Man to Zarathustra. I think this is kind of a nod to the fact that the old man is about to soliloquize a little bit throughout this section of the prologue. And that is exactly what we get. He really does most of the talking, and Zarathustra interjects 3 or 4 times with some good questions and some good, thoughtful responses. So let's jump into it. So interestingly, we actually see that the old man recognizes and remembers Zarathustra. A close reading of this passage might suggest that he even saw Zarathustra make his ascent up the mountain. No stranger to me is the wanderer, many years ago passed he by. Zarathustra he was called, but he hath altered. The old man character is living in the forest. We can surmise that maybe Zarathustra was walking through the forest on his way up the mountain, and the old man saw him. I think that's an interesting note they want to keep tucked in and remember it later on, because he remembers him well enough to note he hath altered. And I want to key in on the use of the word altered here. We see it appear twice in this section of the prologue. First here, and then again 2 graphs down when the old man says, quote, "Altered is Zarathustra, a child hath Zarathustra become. An awakened one is Zarathustra. What wilt thou do in the land of the sleepers?" This repetition of the word altered in combination with the context provided by this graph here really reminded me of Plato's allegory of the cave. And if you recall from yesterday's video on section 1 of the prologue, Zarathustra actually references the cave that he lived in while on the mountain where the sun would shine light on him. So, quick recap for those who aren't wicked familiar with the allegory of the cave. There's a lot of repetition of imagery in Thus Spake Zarathustra so far, and the allegory of the cave story. So, essentially, in the allegory of the cave is used as a literary device to represent living in darkness and lack of knowledge. And there's people chained within the cave and forced to only face the wall of the cave, where shadows from the real world, our three-dimensional world, so to speak, are casted and transmuted onto the wall in front of them. And all they know that's reality is this 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional world. Like, it's a really fascinating concept and metaphor for not knowing something and then knowing something and then applying that knowledge. So ultimately these people are released from their shackles through the power of knowledge, and they journey up into the 3-dimensional world, and for the first time they realize, oh my goodness, what I thought was my entire world was an entire lie, was a lie to me. I never truly comprehended the truth of what I was seeing. And then when we get up there, we learn, oh, there's these things called Platonic ideal forms. So even the things that we're seeing in the real world are just mere representations of the Platonic ideal. So an example that's used is the Platonic ideal of a chair. The idea that there's a perfect chair that exists in like the mind's eye of the universe, or whatever God, all-knowing, omniscient, omnipresent force that creates everything, you know. So like there's an ideal form of everything, and all we're seeing attempts at recreating that form. So it's like we're looking at the blueprint, but we're never able to exactly copy the blueprint. Like when you build a house, you can build a perfect blueprint, and then when you go to put the door on the hinges, it kind of squeaks a little, or it wobbles, or it doesn't close all the way, or there's something funky going on with it. So it's not the ideal, perfect Platonic form of a door, or a chair, or a table, or a flower. So that's essentially a very quickly stated synopsis of the allegory of the cave. And there's more to it, but that's the meat and potatoes of it. You'll have all your macronutrients going forward. I wanted to bring this to our discussion because Zarathustra has seemingly, at least for a period of time in the last 10 years of his life, crawled back into a cave, whether it's Plato's cave or not meant to be. I think the cave imagery is significant here. I'm interpreting the cave as the place where he re-examined the world from this very distilled version of reality. And some supporting evidence that I see here for that type of assertion is something that the old man says, and that is, quote, "Pure is his, Zarathustra's eye," says the old man. And I think pure is a really powerful word choice here, because we associate pure with a lot of good things and a lot of bad things and a lot of medium things. And I think pure is a weighted word, especially in this very religious, biblical context and philosophical context. You know, like, what is pure? Is anything actually pure? So to say Zarathustra's eye is pure is a weighted thing to say, in my humble opinion. here on the internet. So I'll just use two versions of pure and kind of diametrically oppose them upon each other, because that's one way of understanding things. One way of seeing pure is housing the ability to see the good in the world. Very basic, simple idea. Opposed to that would be, okay, his eye is pure. Does that mean he insulates himself from the impurities of the world and therefore not only rejects entire lived realities that aren't pure, which you could argue is every reality? You're not only rejecting it, but you're closing off all your senses entirely to it, and therefore will never understand it. Because if you close yourself off to taking it in, how could you ever understand it? Type of thing. Now, to defend our old man saint, I will say, I think it is, and Zarathustra for that matter, I would argue it's a really natural feeling to want to recede into oneself and quote unquote figure it all out, so to speak. I think the idea of living an examined life kind of lends itself to that. We just want to say, okay, pause. Let me pause for a day. Everyone just pause for one day and let me just figure this out. I know I can figure it out. Just give me a day. So I don't think that's an unnatural want. So I think it's a really honest want from these two dudes. There's certainly patterns of this throughout literary history, and one that comes to mind for me is that of Henry David Thoreau's self-reliance experiment. Henry David Thoreau lived on the shore of Walden Pond for about 2.5 years, and he largely secluded himself from anterior society and kept more of a society of the mind. However, that being said, he didn't really do this alone. I would argue, and many other people argue, it was kind of a faulty experiment. You know, if there's controls in any sort of scientific experiment and, you know, a set parameters to the environment you're in, you know, what is a self-reliant life? I mean, you would assume you're on your own. You know, you've got to have the land yourself, pay for your food, be able to do all the things that you need to do to live. And then I would say take that to the next level for meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, you've got the base, survival. Okay, let's see if we can progress. Do we have time to think and learn and play and, you know, and then up and up and up. So Thoreau didn't really do that. He had an exorbitant amount of support monetarily and socially from his friend and fellow writer and author, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who actually owned the land that he was staying on. So my point here is it can be really grand and awesome to retreat into oneself and contemplate the world. And I think we all do that from time to time. But if we neglect to acknowledge the hard realities of survival at its most basic level, and, you know, the infinite, I would argue infinite nuances of the lived human experience, then I think there's no hope of actualizing these ideals. You know, whatever genius, golden, overflowing well of knowledge that Zarathustra has and this old man, the saint, have, you could argue what's the point in having them if you're just holding on tight to them and not letting them be judged, you know, in the court of life. And I take that a step further and say I think any decent thesis deserves, it has the right to be scrutinized and put through the scientific method. And this is just something that our old man / saint here is refusing. I think it sets the premise for what Zarathustra hopes to do with his own golden wisdom acquired through 10 years of solitude. So let's return back to the text and look at awakening. So according to the saint, Zarathustra and himself are quote-unquote awakened, and everyone in surrounding society is quote sleeping. And because of this, the saint argues, quote, the fall of our footsteps ringeth too hollow through their streets, through everyone else's streets, end quote. I want to posit, perhaps the reason this is so is because your message is hollow, and it can't be transferred to their lives. Going more into some close reading, the saint goes on to group himself and Zarathustra as one and the same. And we see this through the use of language like we, us, concerning us. The old man asks, why not be like me? A bear amongst bears, a bird amongst birds. And I'd return the question back to him, to what end? What does it accomplish being a bear or a bird when you know you're a human? And I know this might sound short-sighted or unempathetic, but I can acknowledge and see the claim, okay, you want to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, thank you, Atticus Finch, in order to increase empathy for others. That's obviously a beautiful and wonderful thing that we as humans can do, but I don't think that's what the argument here is. I don't think that's what it lends itself to here. Rather, in my view, it really more so appears to be a false assertion or false dichotomy where the old man, or anyone for that matter, can never truly be a bear amongst bears, or a bird amongst bears.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
For the simple fact that he knows he's a human. Not a bird, not a bear.
What is going on?
no matter how immersed he becomes in their world. If that makes sense. I think there's more to this argument, and I think it'll illuminate itself as we read on. But that's just my burgeoning thought on that as of right now. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular point I'm making. Continuing on this thought, we see Zarathustra then ask a very, what I'd argue, practical question to the saint, without being too obvious that in his own heart of hearts, he really disagrees with a lot of what the saint is saying. And that question is, and what doeth the saint in the forest? Like, okay, man, you're doing all this stuff. You're saying all this stuff. What do you do every day? Like, what are you doing all day? To what end? To what end are all of these things you're saying? And I think the answer really doesn't have a lot of substance. And I know that sounds harsh, it feels harsh, but listen to this. I think the saint takes court with himself. He says he laughs, he weeps, he mumbles. The core of his answer is, quote, I praise the God who is my God. I think that's really isolating language. I praise the God who is my God. That's not a unifying God that he's praying to, but an individualist's God. I think Zarathustra sees the harm in that assertion. We see that in the very last paragraph where they depart from each other, quote unquote, laughing like schoolboys. I think suggesting that they kind of pity each other and say, oh, he doesn't get it. He doesn't get what I'm putting down. He does not get it. So let's read that last paragraph, okay. When Zarathustra was alone, so this is after they walk away laughing like schoolboys. However, he said to his heart, beautiful language, could it be possible? This old saint in the forest hath not yet heard of it, that God is dead, all caps, exclamation point. I think this cinches a very core disunion between the saint and Zarathustra. And I want to really quickly just pick up on this language of not yet. I think this is implying that Zarathustra thinks this is kind of a common knowledge or a common wisdom thing that he's saying. Well, maybe not common wisdom, but a common knowledge that just hasn't disseminated or trickled down to the saint yet. He's seeing himself as someone who's in the mountains. So when you think of it that very literally, if information is being descended from up to down, he would be one of the first to get that information, and the saint would be one of the last. He's at the foot of the mountain in the forest. He might get the information before the surrounding people, but it seems Zarathustra feels he's working with a bit more information than the saint / old man is. So there's that information value gap here, perhaps. And I'm just picking that from the not yet. And I really enjoyed the way that the saint frames this to Zarathustra and to us and through the writing, that it's almost as if Zarathustra's been out to sea and has now returned to the shore to spread his message inland. And I want to take this moment to just kind of backfill kind of everything that I've mentioned so far in this video with the idea that I think two things can be true. I mean, more than two things can be true, but for the sake of this argument, two things can be true at the same time. We have two diametric opinions here between the saint and Zarathustra. And if we're using the sea as a metaphor, that Zarathustra's mind has been out to sea and now he's come back to shore, I think just because his message might not be immediately or exuberantly accepted doesn't make that information wrong or bad or false or incorrect. It certainly doesn't seem like Zarathustra has any malintent with his objective of spreading his golden knowledge. I'm being very critical of a lot of the writing here on purpose, but that's just to increase my understanding and hopefully maybe your understanding too, or to bring you to your own understanding of the text and what the text is asking us to think of beyond itself. I think the more critical the better, especially in literary analysis. You can always pull back your analysis, but I think I would argue it's more difficult to ramp up your scrutiny on a piece of literature the further into it you get, if that makes sense. I always find if I go easy on a text to begin with, I'm all laxed and just kind of passively taking in each word. Halfway through the book, I can sometimes sit up and be like, wait, I don't agree with this. I've been working with this. I've just been accepting this truth this whole time I've been reading, but I don't actually agree with that. That's kind of the hope and the goal with why I'm doing this to begin with, making these videos, because I really want to encourage myself to look more critically and deeply at these really fascinating and beautifully written artifacts in our literary zeitgeist. And maybe we'll find a community here where we can talk about things in a deep and intent and intense way. Intent and intense. With great intent, intensely. Okay, no, especially when we're reading such philosophically dense and deeply interesting writing like Nietzsche's work here is. Before I end the video, I wanted to lay out some questions that I have going forward from this part of the text. So I'm just gonna go through them and you can read them here on the screen as well. A couple questions I have. At the beginning of this section, the narrator tells us, quote, Zarathustra went down the mountain alone, no one was meeting him. I'm wondering, why did no one meet him, and why is the narrator informing us of this? And I think we kind of touched on this a little bit today, but I think there's more to it. There's got to be more to it. We're on the second section of the prologue. There has to be more to it, statistically, probability speaking. And then my second and final question is this regarding this quote. Fearest thou not the incendiary's doom? Is this suggesting that anyone who's the first to bring a new concept into the social zeitgeist is doomed to be socially exiled? This is kind of a more far-reaching question, but it is something that I think is worth noting. So those are a couple questions I had after reading this section. And yeah, do with that as you will. I'd love to see your questions down below too. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. I know today was a bit longer than yesterday. Yesterday I really spoke more off the cuff just to get that first video rolling, but today I spent some time writing out in essay-like format more of my thoughts and also spoke off the cuff. But I just really appreciate you being here, and please, if you have any thoughts you want to share or feel inspired to share or want to refute any of my assertions made here or anything along those lines, I would love the Socratic discussion. Please, please, please do so. Yeah, I can't wait to read the next section of the prologue and make that video for tomorrow. So I will see you then, and can't wait to read any potential comments below. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a good day.